Good morning, AIMHO. This is Shadeen Say from the AIMHO 365 group, and I'd like to take some time today to welcome you to today's webinar, Freedom of Speech Equals Freedom of Consequence, presented by Mary O'Sullivan and Elena Benitez from the University of Colorado Boulder. Thank you, ladies, for taking the time to educate the region on this topic. We really appreciate what you do for us. As a reminder, this webinar will be recorded and posted to the AIMHO 365 YouTube channel for future review. And please be on the lookout for future webinars from our AIMHO website. Today we will be using the question feature for today's presentation. So if all of our attendees wouldn't mind testing out the question feature by typing in your institution name and how many people are viewing the presentation with you today. Again, a big thank you to our presenters today. Ladies, we're all yours.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Elena Benitez. I am a hall director here at CU Boulder. I hail from the great state of Pennsylvania, where I was in Pennsylvania. I did my undergrad at a state school called Westchester University that was outside of Philadelphia. And then I did my master's program at the University of Pittsburgh.
Hi, y'all. I'm Mary O'Sullivan, also hall director here at CU Boulder. I am originally from the best state, New York, and I did my undergraduate degree at a small private school right outside Boston called Curry College. I like to say it's a college and a food. And then I did my graduate assistantship in New Jersey and moved to Providence, Rhode Island, where I worked for Johnson Wales University for about 4 years before I came here to CU in summer 2017. Really excited to talk about this topic with everyone today, and so please feel free to shoot us any questions you might have along the way. We'll be kind of tag teaming, so there'll be opportunity for one of us to keep track of the questions and then answer them later on.
Awesome. Okay, so we're going to get started. So we did our introductions. So Elena Benitez uses she, her, hers pronouns, and my hooray of the day is that I get to take my dog to the dog park later, and so I'm really excited about that.
And I use she and they series pronouns. This is Mary O'Sullivan again. And my hooray of the day is that it's almost Thanksgiving. I'm very excited to have that day to relax and just spend time with some friends.
Awesome. Okay, so let's jump in. We are going to start talking about like freedom of speech and kind of what that means to us through some research and from some articles that we've read. And so freedom of speech, we're really looking at it as not just our First Amendment, but kind of like a culture that has grown and taken some precedent in our country right now. And we look at free speech in two ways. And so does free speech really mean free? And so really looking at some legal implications here of what from free speech, excuse me. So the person that we have pictured, before we move on, we did this kind of like disclaimer at AIMHO, but we want to make sure that we give you all this grace as well. Some of the photos that we'll be sharing in our presentation are of folks who have some pretty controversial ideas and may be upsetting to some folks. And some of the things that we share of what they their beliefs might be some upsetting to some folks. So we just want to give you all that heads up as we move forward. So back to the legal implications of free speech. The person that you see in this photo here, his name is Chris Cantal, and he is kind of lovingly known on Reddit as the crying Nazi. This man, he organized the Charlottesville march that happened last August, where they were talking about white supremacy. And so to give you some knowledge about who he is and kind of the implications of his decision to speak freely about his beliefs, he has been banned from the state of Virginia for 5 years. In addition to, he is in the process of going through some legal ramifications. He is being charged with endangering people with, not a deadly weapon, sorry, endangering people because he was pepper spraying some folks at this march. And also he spent about 180 days in jail. Right now he's out and he is trying to fight through his legal ramifications, but there's a huge part of free speech that we don't talk about, and that is what happens after you post on Facebook, what happens after you decide to facilitate a march, and they can be pretty serious. And so, shocking, freedom of speech does not equal freedom of consequence. Some other things that we've seen in terms of some legal ramifications about free speech, there was a man who, for a while he was in Montana. Right now the authorities don't know where he is, but he was harassing a woman who was at odds with Richard Spencer's mother through a kind of like real estate battle. And so this man from Montana, he was having some folks, he was a blog writer, an alt-right blog writer, and he was having some folks who follow him reach out to this woman and harass her. He had folks like Photoshop a picture of her and her son in front of Auschwitz. He had people send her death threats. People tell her, like, I know where you live. People show up to her work. And so he just recently, a judge ruled that he would not be protected by the First Amendment free speech. That was kind of like what his lawyer put forward. But that's another huge story that's happening right now, that's going on in terms of the legal implications. And then to the other part of free speech that we think about is like free speech versus hate speech. And so free speech, the way we've looked at it and like the way that we've seen the research is hate speech is classified when it is pointed directly at a certain person, or like a certain kind of group. And so for example, if you have a student or you see someone who's wearing like a MAGA hat, and they say like, like I want to build that wall, that is like their right to free speech, versus like hate speech is if someone was pointing at someone using derogatory slurs, making threats to their life, to their livelihood. Those are the big differences we have found through research between free speech and hate speech.
All right. So we also wanted to talk a little bit about how this shows up for us in real time. And especially both of us being newer to CU Boulder, we have lived through some of these things occurring and been here on campus. And so I do want to give a caveat that these speakers that are named on the slide here, we consider to be controversial. And that is not necessarily in relation to our ideology versus their ideology or kind of their messaging, but is more because when these folks came onto campus or when these things came into the spotlight, there was a backlash. So Milo and Coulter coming to campus, there were some counter protests that happened that I'm going to talk about. And so as I am going through and naming these people as controversial, I want to explain that that's why we consider them controversial. So during my search process, one of the questions that I asked when I was interviewing with CU was, what is a risk that your campus has taken recently and how did that pay out? And the response that I got is that there was a group of students who were really vocal in wanting to bring speakers to campus. And so this group brought Milo Yiannopoulos to campus. And there was a huge backlash from our students on campus who maybe identify as more liberal or don't agree with the messaging that Milo shares, Milo's rhetoric. And so there was quite a lot of counter protesting happening across campus on the night that Milo was speaking. We also, on the same evening that Milo was speaking, by no design, it just happened to work out this way, had Laverne Cox, who is a famous trans actor and activist on campus, and there was no counter protesting for Laverne Cox's speech, just a lot of counter protesting for Milo. When we had Ann Coulter come on campus in March 2018, this actually held some weighty impact among my RA staff. A few of my RA staff had been in discussion with me about their desire to participate in this counter protest. Even though we have our scheduled staff meeting time, it's set across campus that all of the RA staffs meet from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. on a Wednesday night. And that's when Ann Coulter's speech was falling during that same time frame. I worked with my staff to kind of understand where they were coming from and why they wanted to go to this speech, and was able to make some exceptions to our typical staff meeting policy to allow them to participate in something that they felt was really important for them to do. And so with Milo's counter protesting that happened when Milo was on campus, there was not a lot of organization. There was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of back and forth about who was protesting what. There was a lot of different groups represented, and some who weren't even students or really had no affiliation with CU, but wanted to show up on campus and respond to what was going on. And a lot of the counter protests centered around the idea that Milo and folks sharing Milo's ideology and rhetoric should just not be allowed on our campus, and should not be people that are accepted here as speakers. CU Boulder really holds the mentality that we are supposed to really be as neutral as possible. And if students are requesting speakers, or students have folks that are role models in their community or people that they look up to, that as long as students want them to come, that they are welcome on campus. And we'll talk a little bit about CU Boulder's expression of free speech and academic engagement policy a little bit later. With Ann Coulter's protest, it was a lot more organized, the counter protesting that was happening. The students had learned some lessons from the counter protest with Milo, where there was just a lot of chaos and confusion. There was a lot of non-CU affiliated folks who were really going above and beyond in their counter protesting. There were some arrests, and the students who were organizing the counter protest for Ann Coulter really wanted to work against that. And so one of the things that they did was actually start to plan and organize well in advance. As soon as it was announced that Ann was coming to campus, the students created a bunch of shared Google Sheets and forms so that they could communicate about who was going to what and what they were going to do. And so instead of a loud and noisy and very boisterous counter protest, the students made a very concerted effort during the Ann Coulter protest to purchase tickets to the event, which were free of charge, but there is a registration system that CU uses. And so they purchased tickets to the event and took up several rows of seats. Oh, excuse me. In the front of the room. And so at one point during the beginning of Ann Coulter's speech, there was messaging that they really felt was xenophobic and transphobic, and a lot of things that they just really took issue with that she was saying. And so they stood up and silently left the room in protest. And from the conversations that I had with some of my staff members on either side of this protest / counter protest, it sounds like overall it was a much smoother process for the students involved. They knew what they were doing, and they had like a reason or something that they were working towards, which is just a peaceful protest to show that they don't agree with this ideology on campus. We do have a pretty active Turning Point USA group on campus that has brought Milo and Ann Coulter, and I expect to have future things coming up as well. They just recently had a speaker on campus a couple of months ago, or an event on campus. Were you there for that one?
I was not there, but they brought Charlie Kirk, who is Turning Point USA's founder, and Candace Owens, who is one of their pundits.
And so the last thing that we wanted to mention in this area is that at the ACUHO-I conference in Denver, July of this year, there was a speaker who was deemed pretty controversial. There was a lot of backlash to this gentleman, Christian Piccolini, and I won't go fully into all the details, but to give kind of the situation in a nutshell for folks, Christian Piccolini is a reformed white supremacist. He was very active in the alt-right movement, and he gained a lot of viral attention via the website Upworthy last year in some messaging that he has put out about how to most effectively engage with folks in the alt-right or with white supremacists by continuing to reach out, continuing to educate, and seeking to understand where they are coming from. Specifically at ACUHO-I, the moment that was really problematic for a lot of folks in the field was that during Christian Piccolini's session, he shared an example of a gentleman that he knew from his days in the alt-right movement who had told Christian that he had seen a man in the park with a turban, and his immediate response was that I want to kick this guy and I would really like to beat him up. And so Christian Piccolini shared anecdotally that Christian's response to hearing this was to call a mosque and to say, I have a good Christian man who wants to seek to understand and learn more about your religion. Can I bring him with me to the mosque? Is there someone who's willing to speak with him? And so the imam of the mosque sat down with this man and they had a lot of conversation. And from the anecdote that Christian Piccolini shared, it was a very successful conversation, and this man immediately changed his views and realized that he was being very small-minded. And so kind of like rainbows and kittens, everything was great at the end of everything. There was quite a lot of backlash from folks in the room who weren't aware of Christian or his background and history, as well as people who were really bothered by this anecdote that was shared, basically because they truly felt that Christian had put everybody at the mosque in danger by bringing this man who wasn't really seeking to understand and wasn't really invested in being educated or having this conversation, but just kind of misled them about why he was bringing this gentleman there. So all of these things kind of encapsulate, like, this is how freedom of speech and these questions around what is freedom of speech, what is hate speech, this is how this is showing up on our campus. And so a big part of Alana and I's beliefs is that it's not necessarily our job to persuade people, and Alana will delve into this a little bit more, but that we do need to put our own personal feelings aside and really be able to show up the best for all of our students, not just the ones who identify the same as we do in terms of ideology or politics.
Okay. So here we are, just kind of looking at the CU Boulder's definition of the First Amendment and like freedom of expression. So you can see here, I'm just gonna move this part of the screen. It says freedom of expression as guaranteed under the First Amendment and an academic freedom as defined by the laws of the regents, while distinctly separate concepts, are central to CU Boulder's academic mission and underline our community values of inclusivity and critical thinking. Mary mentioned earlier kind of like CU's stance, and it is very true that CU as a whole does take a very neutral approach to how we invite speakers and freedom of thought and expression, but also included obviously in that statement that like we have these community values of inclusivity and critical thinking. And so some questions we have here at the bottom of the slide, we'd love for you to think about. And so we kind of have talked about like, how do we hold students accountable for their speech when it's problematic? Who investigates bias or protected class discrimination on your campus, and what training do student staff on your campus receive around protected class and bias incidents? We can talk a little bit about what CU does. And so how we hold our students accountable in terms of their speech, I think kind of differs from person to person, but at least from my perspective, as Mary mentioned, I don't think it is my job, nor do I think that anyone in our department thinks it's our job to persuade students or to try to convince students of this is the right way to think, this is the right thing for you to believe in, but instead really pushing that cognitive dissonance. And so if I have a student, no matter which student, like I had a student who came up to me after a session during RA training, was like, I'm really proud to be a white guy. Like, how do I tell people I'm really proud to be like a straight white guy? And so, asking him questions of like what that meant and pushing some of that cognitive dissonance for him to think a little bit more outside of what he said. In addition to, I had one of my RAs when we were talking about goals for the year for our hall, his first response was, I want everyone in this hall to be woke. And so really kind of pushing like, what does that mean? What does woke mean? Are we giving people the opportunity to learn and grow? So I think for me, at least, when we talk about holding students accountable, it's really giving them the opportunity to learn from the question that they're asking. And, I would like to think that I'm smart and wonderful and know everything good in the world, but I don't have all the knowledge that is out there. So really also it's my job as an educator to be able to listen to students about where they're coming from and kind of meet them where they are. So that way I can have a better well-rounded understanding of maybe why they said those things. And it's not saying that I'm accepting it or that I think that it's appropriate, but being enough of an adult and being enough of a professional to say, like, while I don't agree with what you're saying, I can hear you and I can help to, ask some questions that might help you think a little bit more critically about this.
Yeah. And I do think that there is just some useful context in this area to share as well. So this screenshot, the image that's currently displayed on the screen, CU Boulder has just launched their own freedom of expression website, which really dives deeply into these things. And so if folks are interested, it's a quick Google search, CU Boulder freedom of expression. But there are a couple things that I think would just be useful for folks to know in terms of CU Boulder's background and history. And one of the main things that I thought would be interesting to share is that CU Boulder's 5th president, George Norlin, is pretty well heralded on campus here as an advocate for the rights of others. And so during the early 1900s, Colorado's Ku Klux Klan affiliated governor had threatened to take away all state funding from CU unless Norlin fired all Jewish and Catholic faculty that worked at the institution. Norlin decided that he would rather do without that support and continue to operate as planned, and did so for 1 year. So there was 1 year that CU operated without any state funding whatsoever. Norlin pretty much fundraised on his own to be able to make that happen because he was so entrenched in his belief that he was not going to be bullied by the Ku Klux Klan of Colorado. And so every CU Boulder commencement that is on campus, they read Norlin's charge, which is a speech that he first read to the class of 1935 about why that was so important for him to be able to do so. So to kind of get back to some of these questions here, we do have an Office of Institutional Equity and Compliance that investigates bias or protected class discrimination incidents on campus. They are really a huge resource for us here in the hall director role, where if there's something that's come up and we are just not sure where it's going to land, we're able to call them and have a consult conversation and just figure out what is best. And so we actually have a very intricate whiteboard policy in relation to what is free speech versus what is bias or protected class discrimination, because all of our student rooms have a whiteboard affixed to the front door of the room. And so, as you can imagine, with a mostly first-year student population living on campus, we run into a lot of issues with students posting jokes that they think are really funny and witty and are maybe actually offensive or could have harm for other students living in the building. And so one of the things that we do is there's different levels to the response in terms of what is posted and what are we going to be doing to address that. It may be that OIEC will handle the follow-up and have some conversation with the students about why what was posted is problematic or is not okay, or it might come back to the hall director to have those conversations. And so to give an example of this, I had an incident last year where my students had written on their whiteboard, "I identify as a pink unicorn," and some other pieces as well. And there was some relationship also on the board in this joke about like pronouns, like how you can refer to me. And I had several students living in the building and 2 on that floor who were actively in transition. And so there was a lot of negative impact for them to walk out of their home and see that first thing in the morning before they're headed to a test or a final exam. And so the students were not really understanding why this was a concern or why there could be negative impact for folks. And so it did take creating some of that cognitive dissonance, like Alana mentioned, to say, okay, what are the ways in which you identify? If I wrote something along the lines of, that I'm kind of making a joke out of your identities, what would the impact be for you there? When they still weren't really necessarily understanding it, I was like, okay, if somebody had written something on your door, this is the kind of outreach that I would be doing to you because there's potential for there to be some emotional harm here. Let's talk through that aspect of things, that if the roles were reversed and this had just been posted on your door, I'd be checking in with you to see if you're okay and offering you resources. once I started to have the conversation from that angle of like, even if you don't feel like this was harmful for you, that doesn't mean that it wasn't for someone else. And really walking them through, like, these are the support systems that we would offer to a student who's been impacted by this, sort of help them to realize that maybe this was a bigger deal than they initially considered, because they have some privilege in this area, that it's not something that they need to think a lot about. Do you want to take the last one?
Sure. And so the last question of what training do student staff on your campus receive around protected class and bias incidents? We had, during this RA training, we had 2 days that were kind of really focused on like the policy. Props to Mary, because she facilitated that and she worked on that schedule. But we really focused on, we had our Office of Institutional Compliance and Equity come in. We had our campus partners like our Office of Victims Assistance and our counseling office come in to really talk to students about what bias and protected class incidents look like and how they can support their students. And not only that, but like how they can kind of be able to support themselves if something like this happens. And, obviously the hall directors and our campus partners are there to support them, but like how they're able to cope with some of the things that they may see while still being able to try to stay as neutral as they can and support their students. Go ahead.
We also tried something new this year, which was breaking out our behind closed doors scenario-based training. So we still did do behind closed doors, but we separated our behavioral behind closed doors incidents with our mental health and protected class discrimination incidents. So we did 2 separate sessions of behind closed doors and just kind of really focused on, during the mental health, protected class discrimination, what are some of the nuances or these kind of things that maybe aren't written in black and white in a manual that you may need to know. And so how do you have a conversation with somebody when they are holding viewpoints that are really challenging for you, and how do you work around that?
Great. Okay, so I had the really great opportunity when I was working in Philadelphia last year to attend a law symposium where we had Dr. Sigal Ben-Parath come and speak to us about free speech. And so she actually has just published a book pretty recently called Free Speech on Campus. And this here is a quote from one of her colleagues kind of reviewing the book. The quote says, "Free speech on campus makes a valuable contribution to a debate that has often been marred by confusion. In the campus context, Ben-Parath's argument that we may protect students from dignitary harm, but not from intellectual challenge, helps us to think clearly about the importance of not censoring speech on the basis of its intellectual content." And so when Mary and I were looking at some of Dr. Ben-Parath's work, and we were looking a little bit over the reviews, I think we really kind of thought this quote encompassed what we're trying to discuss, and a huge part of what we're looking for here within this conversation is that we as professionals, we should be protecting students from any harm that comes from free speech or the language that people are using on our campus, absolutely. But it is not, we should not be protecting them in any sense of the word from things that people are saying that challenge what they believe in. And this is really important. I think as an institution of higher education, especially for folks who are not necessarily on the academic side, I think we really pride ourselves on trying to help students learn some of those transferable skills, those skills that help them cope, help them learn. Like I always tell my students, I always want to help you be better than when I got you. And so I think that as professionals on campus, predominantly in housing, I think it's really important to look at this in a way that we are supporting our students from the kind of like the dangers of free speech, where like some stuff can be really harmful and demoralizing, but not from the challenge of what's being said, because that gives us the opportunity to learn. I think what's really great about working on a college campus is I feel like I have conversations with students every day that challenge me and that help me learn a little bit more about myself or about the context. Coming from Philadelphia, what my thoughts and beliefs and like my perspective on things is way different than here in Colorado. And so, I mean, I think about, and this is like a little off topic, but I think about just recently we had a proposition that was being voted on here in Colorado, and my gut reaction to in which way to vote was a certain way based off of my perspective from where I've lived before. And it wasn't until I got to have conversations with some other folks who were native to Colorado who shared their perspectives with me that it got me thinking a little bit more about what this proposition would really mean for the state and for the folks who live in it. And so I think that it's really important that we're looking at how we encourage our students to view free speech as maybe not necessarily something that's bad, but that's something that is necessary for our own growth. So when we talk about censorship, Mary and I decided to kind of touch base on something that we think is really interesting within our profession. And some of you who are listening may or may not be a part of these groups. But the Facebook groups on with student affairs, affiliations to them, we kind of thought this graphic describes pretty well of sometimes like what those Facebook posts and pages look like. And so it was funny when we did this presentation at AIMHO, we were like, who people's names are sometimes, like, or you see people like, really going hard in the comments, and we had some people shake their heads and laugh. And so it's kind of good to feel affirmed that it's just not Mary and I being hypercritical of our colleagues at different institutions, but that other folks do see this as something that as a profession we need to be a little bit more cognizant of.
Yeah, and one of the things that we talked about at AIMHO itself was there have kind of been some trends that we have noticed in the Facebook pages where if people are not really responding well to criticism that they've received, or if there is like a deletion of comments where folks have put a lot of labor into trying to educate, there have been a few times that folks have self-reported that they have been screenshot, and those screenshots have been sent to their higher ups at their departments, at their home institutions. And so we both individually kind of find it really fascinating that even though we are in this field where we are ideally all giving students the grace to explore their beliefs and kind of figure out where they identify politically and what do they value as human beings, that then as adults, we are not giving the same grace to our peers, and instead are saying, I'm going to go ahead and tell on you because I don't like how you handled this. So just some food for thought. And if you would like to talk further about the Facebook pages in general or things that you'd observed, we would love to have that conversation as well when we have time at the end for questions.
Absolutely. The one thing that I'll just add to this before we move on is that Mary and I had a conversation about we do our best in our work every day to be good role models for our students. And so the thought is, what if our students saw us interacting with each other like this? Like, how could we possibly expect them to, have some grace from other people, to be able to learn, to be able to put their best foot forward and being better citizens if we're not doing that for each other?
So this happened, this situation that we're about to discuss happened right before we went to AIMHO on the 9th of November. And to put it in a nutshell, a lot of institutions are releasing their own statements in relation to some of the things that have been going on legally in terms of protection for transgender or non-binary students on college campuses. There seems to have been some effort to remove legal definitions from federal websites, and there's a lot of concern around what is that going to look like for non-binary and trans folks on college campuses moving forward. The University of California, Berkeley recently put forth their own statement to basically to say that we support transgender and non-binary students and that we will do what we can to support their rights on campus, regardless of whatever the federal government decides to do. The state senate, the student government at UC Berkeley was voting whether they should incorporate this statement into their own constitution. And one of the senators decided to abstain from voting. So not only did Senator Chao abstain from voting, but she also released a statement about why. And in her statement, Senator Chao mentions that due to her religious beliefs, that she really cannot support any legislation that would say that there is anything besides men and women. Based on her values and her religious ideals, that she really can't support students who are transgender or non-binary because that doesn't really align with her worldview. There was a huge backlash to her releasing this statement. A lot of students seem to feel that it would have been fine for her to abstain, but in releasing the statement, she did a lot of active harm. There was quite a lot of backlash from students who are trans or non-binary or genderqueer, so sort of a bunch of different ways that folks identify in this area, that they really don't feel that she is fit to serve the student body if she can't support all of the students that are within that student body. And so a petition was released, and in about 24 hours, there was over 1,000 signatures demanding that she resign from student government. And so I found this really fascinating because just as this student had the right to abstain from voting and release a statement to explain why, the other students had the opportunity to go to a 2 or 3 hour associated student government meeting and have open floor to explain that even though Senator Chao may not think that her statements were bigoted, that they did. And so a lot of students got up and made statements about why they feel that she should resign, why they find her viewpoints to be problematic, why maybe she should have just abstained from the vote and not shared her opinion. And so just as this student had the right to share her opinion, the students that she serves within student government had the same right to do so. So moving into the end of our presentation here, we do have a couple of case studies. And so at AIMHO itself, we had our group of participants in the audience kind of get together and discuss these two issues and talk about how they would handle it. We can leave this up for a few minutes, although I don't think we'll have as much discussion as we did at AIMHO itself. And I think now would probably be a good time as well if y'all have any questions for us to answer, that we could go ahead and do so.
So if any question feature on the right side of your screen to type in any questions you have for our presenters today, we will address them. So we'll give you guys a few moments to think of your questions and type them in. Seeing no questions at this time, we'll turn it back over to our presenters for any final statements that they would like to make regarding their presentation. Mary or Alana, do you have anything additional to add at this time?
I think for me, something I shared with Alana after we did this presentation in person is that I have always really identified with a statement from Voltaire, which is that I may not like what you're saying, but I do believe you have the right to say it. And my caveat to that is unless you are negating basic human rights.
Yes. Similar to Mary, my belief and kind of like my position with free speech on campus is that I think at the current point in our climate in this country, there's a lot of feelings and there's a lot of emotion that's behind the things that people say. And as someone who can subscribe to those feelings, many times when I hear things going on, I also think that it's really important that we remember that no matter if you believe in or you value the things that your students are saying, or that they hold values, that it's our job to support our students no matter who they are. And as hard as that may be, I think that if we can like find that empathy within ourselves to be able to try to connect with our students, even if we disagree with them, that we are teaching some really valuable lessons about how we find it important to interact and how to connect with people. That is not me saying at all, like, if someone says something that's really offensive or that's really discriminatory, that you're like, you know what, I don't care that you said that. I'm still going to take you to get lunch. It's really more of like, I hear what you're saying. I don't agree with you, and being honest about that. But I'm still here to support you, and I still want to make sure that you're successful here.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Mary and Alana, for taking your time to put together this presentation, not only as a webinar, but at our past annual conference that we all just returned from, and sharing your knowledge on the subject. AIMHO 365 really appreciates what you do for our region. For our attendees today, please be on the lookout for future webinars on the AIMHO website. And until next time, have a great and safe holiday weekend. Goodbye, everybody.
Okay.